Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related stuff. 10 minutes of escape from the everyday world to think about ancient warfare. You can ask me a question via postcard, via email. You can comment on a previous podcast or video, and I'll attempt to answer it. You can listen to the big podcast, Ancient Warfare podcast or Ancient History podcast. You can even back us on Patreon. This is a part two because I got carried away with the last question. This is a second part of answering Chris's question. See previous podcast. I recently read your article about the Siege of Masada in Ancient Warfare magazine and had a couple of questions regarding assumptions made about the shortened timeline of the siege. Specifically, you mentioned two assumptions supporting the idea of a shorter siege. I was curious if you could provide more information or sources to support this hypothesis. I got carried away with the second part of the question about the reliability of Josephus and waxed on about that and completely forgot, sorry, Chris, to answer this part of your question. So the shorter timeline is something that has been argued in various different modern authors since. There's not really anything specific in Josephus' timeline about the siege to tell us how long it took. It's very vague in the sense of how long was the Roman force there. But if you have a look at the further reading in the issue of the magazine, Campbell 1988, Berlin 2002, Campbell 2010, Cotton 89, Guichon, Magnus, and various others, they will start talking about the shortened length of the siege. Now, one of the reasons for that is that you've got logistics and supply issues in terms of how much water they would need. And there's no water source for a besieging force at Masada. They would have to bring it all in. And even though Masada is the last of the fortresses reduced, which might imply that they've made the land surrounding it compliant by that point, still a bit risky. One of the other problems, of course, of the zealots in Masada, they can't get out. It's not so much a matter of the Romans are vulnerable to attacks from them. On the precipice of Masada, they can't sally out to attack the Roman siege force, which is another argument as to why it was quick, because they're not under any threat, they're not any imminent threat. They also, as a legion, depending on the size, we're told 900, but including women and children are inside Masada, and the legion's got 5,000 men. It outnumbers the defendants 5-1, more probably. So in that sense, that allows the Roman siege force to build quickly. But for me, and this is based on Dobson's arguments in previous issues of the magazine, which I referred to, the amount of water and fodder and food that they need to sustain the besieging force is so vast that the idea that they would do that for longer than is absolutely necessary is unnecessary. I think that the idea that you would besiege as quickly as possible and to minimize the amount of time you're going to need to bring those supplies in. So I think in the article, this was based on some 19th century British statistics that, per day, each man was allocated 4.5 liters of water, each horse 45.5 liters of water. And that's not in the Judean desert during the campaigning season. So De Silva's army of 8,000 men, that's getting up to a lot of water, 36,000 liters of water a day for the men alone. And that's not including camp followers or auxiliary support. So that 8,000 is the legion and the auxiliaries, the soldiers only. Any other additional personnel isn't included in that number. So if you do it swiftly, that obviously will reduce the amount of water you need to bring in. If you don't, it increases that. And with each increase in the train that needs to bring this water in over quite a big distance, you're dealing with a lot of transporting of water. I mean, for the cavalry, it's 91,000 liters of water a day. That's assuming 2,000 cavalry. There may have been more. And, if it's a 7-week siege, that's 4.5 million liters of water. That's crazy. So all of that just tends to make me think it's shorter, because bringing that in logistically every day is craziness. And that doesn't include fodder or food. So it would probably be a continuous train of supply to this besieging force. So of course you're going to want to bring it to a conclusion quickly. Combined with that, if the defending force can't attack you effectively, they can throw missiles. Then until you are vulnerable to those, that the ramp and the circumvallation and the camps are not vulnerable until the very end of their production. So the idea that you would have, say, for instance, 8,000 men building this ramp as quickly and as efficiently as possible is going to speed up the process and speed up the siege rather than slow it down. I think there's no point in prolonging a siege and, the starving out of Masada with all of the supplies that have been brought in, and again, Josephus estimates how long the supplies they had could have lasted. I think it's 2 years, but that's for a much larger garrison. So, they weren't going to starve them out. So that decision to build the ramp to assault the wall, you're not going to dilly-dally when that decision's been made. And I think when they arrive, they make that decision nigh on immediately. And so all of those factors tend to make me think that it's a much faster siege. We don't know, we're not told, but it could be around the clock operations to build that ramp, not just daylight hours, in which case, again, it's faster again still, with 8,000 men working on what is essentially a limited area around the clock. Building makes sense. If you split your men into 3 8-hour shifts, you can get that work done and continuously done. Again, you're not really in danger of a sally from the enemy. You've got guards as well. All of those things tend to make me think that it's a much faster siege than we've sort of been tending to think. There was the miniseries Masada back in the 80s. I remember watching that at school. So all of these things, I think, tend to make me think that it was a much shorter siege than popular opinion would have. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting issues with the end of the siege and the way that Josephus reports it, which comes back to, again, the previous issue about the reliability of Josephus. There's not the burning evidence. There's not the evidence of bodies the way it's described. Therefore, what's going on in the end of the siege, and what's it's the very end of his account of the Jewish war is the fall of Masada, and it's the the Masada which has become a national icon and a day of remembrance in modern Israel. But I wonder if there's a historian's agenda going on there about what actually happened. So it's a tricky one to try and, because you're basically arguing from silence or from archaeology only, whereas you have a literary source that contradicts that. So how do you argue that what actually happened isn't what we're told happened? For instance, if it was a Roman massacre of the 900 people, save for was it 5 or 7 survivors? I think maybe 7 survivors. Why would you rewrite that in the way that Josephus may have done? And why rewrite it that way? It's a very perplexing issue, but archaeology doesn't really seem to support Josephus' version of history in this case. And it's also very odd that the Romans would get to the wall and then abandon it for the night before assaulting. I think that a legion facing, let's say, of those 900 zealots, half of them are fighting men. A legion and auxiliaries is not going to not push forward its attack on what essentially amounts to a cohort. It's even in the dark, it's going to establish a bridgehead inside the fortress and then push the attack on in the morning, if not just push the attack on in the night. So it's very peculiar, but we're not really any closer to any answers. So that's how it is. Anyway, I hope that answers your second part of the question, Chris. Sorry I didn't get to it last time. You can, of course, ask us a question on Ancient Warfare Answers. Send us an email, postcard. Always love a postcard. And I look forward to seeing you again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.